you to a conversation with Ashley Kahn about his book, The Days of Miracle and Wonder, Paul Simon and the Trials and Triumphs of Graceland. This book is available for purchase from the Country Bookshop, and you can also get it as an audio book. I'll introduce the bookshop and Ashley, and then we'll begin our discussion. The Country Bookshop was founded in 1953 and is in Southern Pines, North Carolina. The bookstore was purchased by our local biweekly newspaper, The Pilot, in 2010, and we are honored to be a part of a thriving community journalism. I want to thank you for shopping with us, listening to this or watching this conversation, sharing it, and buying this book and other books from us. It is because you shop with us at the bookshop that we are able to bring you conversations like this one, bring authors to our town, and to continue to participate in small town life. I would like to introduce you with a brief bio of Ashley Kahn, who is a Grammy Award-winning music historian, author, and producer. He co-wrote Carlos Santana's autobiography, is a producer of the documentary of Carlos Santana, and has written books on recordings like My Kind of Blue by Miles Davis and A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. He's also written a book on George Harrison interviews and encounters, edited Rolling Stone the 70s, and wrote The House That Train Built, the story of Impulse Records. He was a member of the Graceland tour production team and tour manager for Ladysmith Black Mambazo. How do I say it?
You
LBM.
did it correctly. Like it's written, Ladysmith Black Mambazo.
He teaches at NYU's Clive Davis Institute for Recorded Music and has received a score of awards for his music writing. And it's really an honor to have you here to virtually to chat with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me, Kimberly, and I loved hearing the history of the bookstore and the community aspect of what you're doing. It's great.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah,
that's why it means so much for you to show up because it really brings, so much like the record. It like brings the whole world to a place, and I really appreciate
absolutely.
that.
No, I get that. I get that. There's an extreme value in that connectivity.
Yes. Well, I mean, so much of the book that you pulling themes from you telling the story, but also just pulling themes. So much of it of what you're writing about centers around kind of Graceland and as a function, as a symbol and metaphor for community and collaboration. Can you talk about
I'd
that a
love
little
to.
more?
I love that you picked up on that. I mean, the whole idea behind it, especially with the research, and was to allow as many voices as possible, pertinent voices, appropriate voices, from that period to speak, and also putting value on what was said in real time when Grayson was happening in the 80s, because that was a different decade. It was a
Yes.
different time. It was, a different spirit in the air, and the air itself was different, especially when you think about where politics were.
Yeah, you talk about it at the end of the book, and I was gonna talk about it at the end of this conversation, but it seemed to me that I'm scrolling down in all my notes here.
That's quite
Um,
all right.
but can as the producer and as somebody who is there, you yourself, you're a historian and a witness to this.
Right.
I'll ask my question, but can you go a little bit deeper or color in a little more about that hopeful energy of that moment in the 80s,
Of
with
course. Of
kind of
course.
at the end, the production part.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's put it this way: Grayson was a phenomenon in on many levels, and that was one of the challenges in the book because I was talking about, the zeitgeist, the '80s themselves, where music was, and the role that music had. And remember, this is the first flowering of MTV. And the coming of digital recording and the coming of digital instrumentation, so there is different quality of sounds and recording approaches taking place. At the same time, it was the Reagan years, and the the politics of the day, especially in the way that it connected with South Africa, I needed to go into and speak about. And it was tough. It was, a majority of the population down there was under subjugation of this very nefarious political system. It was racism by by law. It was that.
There was a phrase in your book that struck me, and I can't remember where, but it was like it was someone reflecting, saying it was so the apartheid system was so entrenched, even as they were starting to repeal the laws, they didn't even need law. Very I'm speaking to
Yeah, yeah.
Carolina,
Oh,
you
right.
know.
That was from a New York Times article that the great Joseph Lelyveld, who ended up being managing director for New York Times, he was the South African correspondent on that day. And there's an amazing book that really captures that moment just before apartheid is dismantled, called Move Your Shadow. I recommend that to anyone. Speaking of books, but yeah, the idea that apartheid was so entrenched that even within the black community, it had infected the whole system of power structures, of how business was done, etc., even amongst blacks themselves. So it was a very, very tough situation for Paul Simon to go down there. And so how to handle that. And then, you mentioned the whole role of being a witness. So trying to get as many voices into the book, not just Paul's, but Paul is important, and valuing what Paul had to say in the moment as he's very meticulously approaching this difficult situation of how to do it politically, how to do it monetarily, how being aware of his public image and his stature and him being an entitled rock star, with all these resources at his disposal, and yet, there's that possibility of being charged with exploitation, but he was all in. In the past, he had done recordings where he went down to Jamaica famously and did, Mother and Child Reunion, amazing tune from the early 70s. But that was just one tune on the album. This was an all in proposition. And the whole album, I mean, he comes back from South Africa with the roots of like six tunes out of 11 that will eventually be on the album
Well,
Graceland.
the building of it, and again, back to the themes and just, the way you take this like giant unwieldy subject and pull it together. But just it all kind of goes back to those partnerships. And it seemed really
Yeah,
interesting to me watching, and of course, there's so many the timeline brings in different partnerships over the course of
right.
this project. But one of the partnerships that I would love to kind of begin this conversation about how he structured partnerships and the integrity of those partnerships that allowed for the integrity of the larger global conversation when the album came out is Roy Hadley. In his production, I mean, like he just is like the actual rock star of this book. It's not to me. I mean, he's every step of the way. He's like not like a musician, but like a magician, like a production musician with his like hanging of the mics or the way the recordings come in, and he plays with it and just from the get-go. And I didn't know what kind of character he was going to be in the story as you introduce him into the book, and he's like in South Africa and
Oh no, you froze.
respecting this studio and the people in it. Oh, am I frozen now?
No,
Still?
not now.
Okay.
Now you're okay.
Well, let's talk about Roy and his drive to get the best
Yeah,
and that connection with Paul. And it seems like that was the fundamental connection across all of these partnerships was just this pure drive of making the best music.
yeah.
Um,
No, I'm really really happy to hear not only that you picked up on Rory Halley's role, but the excitement that you obviously feel about it, because Roy had been with Paul Simon since Simon and Garfunkel days. When Simon and Garfunkel in 1963 auditioned for Columbia Records, it was a very young Roy Halley who had just joined the staff at CBS, who was actually engineering them. And because of his relationship with both Artie and with Paul, he would stay with them through their whole career, Simon and Garfunkel, and then stay with Paul and Artie when they did solo albums in the 70s. There was a transition period when Roy was not there, and a guy named Phil Ramone took over. But anyway, Roy is the magician, as you put it. He's there every step of the way. He's in every recording session and every editing and mixing session. He is the guy who decides. With Paul's blessing, of course, because it's really a collaboration between the two of them. He's the guy who decides, okay, we have all this new technology in the studio now. How do we maintain a kind of analog warmth and authenticity to the sound, but at the same time take advantage of what digital technology, digital recording can give us, and that's part of the book too. And I really don't want to not have that be there. And I know it's not going to be everyone's favorite thing to talk about, but
Well, it's a little bit of mine, and I have a. You said at one point in the book that, and I'm repeating this because I'm wondering if you can contextualize it,
sure.
because you talk about how you're at this crossroads of technology and how this would not have this album would not have been made necessarily without the fact that it was analog recorded and digitally edited. And when he goes into the mixing studio with the other dude, that he didn't know if it what kind of combination he was going to use, that they had both.
Right.
But can now in music, it's,
Oh, right. You're talking about the mastering at the end, because he
yeah,
had a digital mix and he had an analog mix at the end, and
that was cool.
I know, and so he left it in both possibilities till the very end, and then he went with analog.
What is there more information about that choice? And really what I'm asking is kind of a comparison. What I'm curious about is a comparison to today, when there's such in the face of today's technology crossroads with AI, there's such a return to analog,
Yeah.
the
Uh,
convenience of digital. Like, is that the kind of production that's being replicated now? Or like I just have no frame of.
no, it's okay. I mean, here I am trying to like dig into my own memory banks to the '80s and remembering, hey, back then there was some movement. People had buttons that said "back to mono," like monaural recording, not stereo, monaural recording, which of course was how we first heard the Beatles, how we first heard Rolling Stones, all the stuff from the early six,
Can you
Motown.
can you tell us what mono is, just for the.
Mono is a single channel as opposed to a stereo split, so that the audio environment that you're listening to is a single kind of source, you know. So it's, to some ears, it doesn't have the possibility of the three dimensionality that stereo and other like 5.1 surround sound, etc., gives you. But at the same time, there's a direct kind of quality, and it really, I mean, it's what we listen to as far as recorded sound for many many decades, and our ears were used to it. And so the magic happens in the mix, so to speak, as opposed to the playback. I
It's
hope
just
that's clear.
well, it's just interesting having this conversation about technology, this crossroads of music technology in the 80s, from 2026, as we're again at a major technological crossroads for music
Yeah,
production.
yeah,
And but to go back to these. these partnerships.
By the way, I should add one other thing about digital because that everything that was happening with digital editing really became the standard for the whole industry to the point that now cut and paste, which is what we call it, you can just move a file over, or move a little music snippet over, and do it all digitally. Back then, they didn't have that. It was digital tape, but still the idea of no degradation, no, that you could play around and play around with stuff in the digital realm and then transfer it back to analog for the warmth. That's really what Roy Halley's magic was, just to explain it fully.
No, I appreciate that because what I want to ask next, the structure of this with Paul's ear, and you talk, he's respecting, he's developing these partnerships with this incredible, talented group, and it's it's just fascinating to me. But the idea that sorry, I got distracted for one moment, but
It's
so
okay.
he's doing these recordings and then come and just setting this environment for people to just do their best and to just thrive and to speak to each
Yeah.
other and bring people in the studio. And then you talk about how he returns and just takes everything home and just listens to different parts he wants to isolate, and then they kind of build it together. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this, not only the technology, but this, give some context for this kind of listening and splicing together. Is that a function of this record? Is that a function of the technology? Is that, can you just give some?
Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind that this was such a major left turn for Paul himself, as not only a songwriter, but a song crafter, because he had, his craft really was working in the studio and taking a song and working with the engineer and bringing in the right mix of musicians to help it become the hit song that it would be. 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, or Still Crazy After All These Years. Now, that's the way that he had been doing it before Graceland, starting with words, starting with chords, and then embellishing it and building up the rest of it, including the rhythm. What was different, hugely different, about Graceland is that he's starting with the rhythm, and he has to write to a rhythm that has these weird African offbeats and syncopation, etc. And his way of writing needs to change in order to match this. This is very much like hip hop, where you start with a beat and then create lyrics or rhymes to a beat.
Yes.
And he's very aware of this, and he starts to approach the studio in a much looser, more flexible kind of way, in which some musicians down in Africa or in Louisiana, because he's working with Zydeco artists, or with Los Lobos in LA. He approaches the studio. Sometimes he's in the control room directing the whole picture. Sometimes he's in the live room with the musicians, and kind of inventing stuff in the moments. And each band and each song and each moment is done very differently. But he's giving himself that kind of flexibility. So it's not a Phil Spector going in and saying, do this, do this, do this. It's very collaborative.
Do you have the book there with you?
Yeah, I do.
On page 4, there's a quote at the bottom. Would you read it for us? It's from Paul, and it's like halfway through that last paragraph at the bottom of page 4, and it starts with, "In fact."
You want me to read it for you?
Please.
Okay. Happy to do it. In fact, I'll read the whole paragraph.
Okay.
Quote, this is a question being asked him in 1990 by the way, Paul Zollo, a great music journalist. Does your best work come from active conscious thinking about what a song should say? He was asked in 1990. He negated the idea, saying, quote, in fact, I consciously try not to think what a song should say, because what I'm interested in is what I find, as opposed to what I'm planning. I like to be the audience too. I'd like to discover what it is that's interesting to me. I'd like to discover discover it rather than plot it out.
I think it's so interesting in that coming in the way that you're talking about it, being reminded that that quote was from 1990. And to your point about as you're researching this, there's Graceland in the moment, Graceland in the recordings, and that's a reflective Paul Simon.
Right.
You know,
Talking after the fact. But, the thing is, Kimberly, that if you look at Paul's output musically since Graceland and only focus on that, it really was a major shift in his creative approach. And you listen to some, and they're such beautiful albums. I can't, recommend them enough. Albums like Surprise, So Beautiful or So What, and I urge your audience to actually use Graceland as a window or as a doorway into exploring later Paul Simon, mature Paul Simon.
I love that. And I will link in addition to the book Move Your Shadow. You so much of as one of the things you talk about his as he's kind of sculpting the album almost, it reminds me of the way sculptors talk about chiseling their stone and it's emerging. They're not doing anything. It's like already in the stone.
You know what he would used to do, and I do mention this in the book, is put himself in a kind of semi dark room and with the ability to throw a rubber ball against the wall and bounce it off and just get into this rhythm where he's constantly bouncing a ball into so the action kind of distracts him and his body has something to do and his mind gets into a zen like state and the lyrics come to him, you know. And so he's in a way kind of forcing the moment where he's not thinking. And one of the perfect examples on Graceland is that you know crazy stanza out of nowhere in the song Graceland, the title track, where he goes, there's a girl in New York City who calls herself the human trampoline, and you're like, wait, what? What does that have to do with what we're just? But it's so engaging and funny and also maybe sexy, you know? And she means we're bouncing into Graceland, you know? And the inner logic of that just makes such perfect sense and it's fun and flowing and it works. And
Well, and it
you
also
know,
reminds me, you talk about him, and I could be pulling this from the wrong part of the book or what, but he's talks about getting the bounce as he's sharing, as he's developing the
right,
album,
that's the word he uses.
and
Yeah,
and when he's talking about he's whispering into other people's ears, and you bring up that he's sharing it with Philip Glass
he's
and David
sharing the
Byrne
process.
to get the bounce.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about artists who invite other artists into into the atelier to check out, the this big new project that they're working on. You think about Picasso, and how him and Georges Braque were, kind of inventing cubism at the same time, but in separate studios a couple of miles apart, and they would check each other's work. That's really what Paul was doing with Graceland, and he was very open about it. And yeah, he would call that the bounce. So we'd bring in a David Byrne or Philip Glass or Charles Grodin, you know, and people like that. A bunch of Laurie Anderson, people who were kind of at the top of the New York music culture scene at the moment, but also, personal friends, Lorne Michaels from Saturday Night Live.
Well, and that goes back to the community aspect of this whole album developing and thematically. It's interesting to me too as you talk about, when a and I in so many other books and history, when it's time, when an idea's time has come, it is coming everywhere. You worked with Peter Gabriel and you mentioned him in the book as well.
Yeah,
And it's coming everywhere. And I'm curious, as you speaking to you as a music historian or journalist, kind of the function of creativity and when Paul's under the limelight after Graceland is out and he's talking about following the music and he's talking it seems and this question is not well formed, so you're gonna have to bear with me. So think about your answer as I'm muttering
sounds
through.
like my writing.
Well, your writing in this book does not come through that way. It
No,
comes,
but at the start, when I
okay.
first put it on the page, it's like, wait, what am I trying to
What
say?
am I trying to say? Yes, that is exactly what this is. But his the role, it seems like the role of an artist to just interpret what's coming at them, to follow their
Yeah,
curiosity, pull
yeah,
in, and somehow if you're doing that and you stay true to just following the curiosity, you're saying something that you could not have imagined what the impact is later.
no.
You're just but because you were true to this, because you were following this like growth edge, because you didn't back away from the fear. It,
Yeah, I mean, but this works on so many different levels. One is the major creative shift he's doing internally and in his own world. The second is the realization at a very, very early stage that he is giving himself a challenge to figure out the right way of handling going down to South Africa and working with black artists as a very privileged white rock star with stature and resources, etc., at his disposal, with a very public image. And
Mhm.
so, how to handle that right, but being true to that, like you were saying, this kind of intention that is driving him, and saying he could have given his stature and abilities, tried to recreate the sound with New York studio cats. You know, he said no. I mean, from the very beginning, he said to himself, if I'm going to collaborate on this music, I want to work with the same musicians I'm hearing on this cassette that a friend gave me, this bootleg cassette that has my attention and won't let me go. You know,
Mhm.
and he would later say, what, I should have fallen in love with Nigerian music or Ghanaian music or music from some other part of Africa, and he wouldn't have had all these headaches. But at the same time, it wouldn't have been the same album, and it wouldn't have inspired him in the same way. There's something about South African music that stands out, especially this one township jive style that really stands out from everything in Africa, and really was a refreshing change, a breath of fresh air, given the music that was around in the 1980s.
You talk about that township jive, and you have a quote from somebody else talking about when it came out internationally and being such a big hit that it was the first time uh, many white South Africans heard Black South African music.
Yeah.
And to me, that was such an interesting parallel to what the Stones did with Southern blues for white audiences. It seemed just a structural similarity.
the way music and history works together, it's a repeated cycle. Especially when you think about music as this kind of neutral ground between races. and between ethnicities in such a way that it makes for a usually safer place in which a certain equality, a certain collaborative spirit, where all the other social concerns and imprints that we are living with can sort of fade away to a moment where we feel that spirit of possibility, of tolerance, of coexistence, of mutual respect and equality that was embedded in our Constitution, and which I wish we were following today.
I mean, that's why I think it's so interesting your book coming out today and the conversation, the opportunity to have this conversation in today. Um,
Yeah,
but in talking about what music can do, I think it's because it's the most efficient communication device. And so,
it's
and
also the most emotional.
yes,
Straight to the heart, straight from the heart.
the because it doesn't have any translation. It doesn't have to go be translated into words or written or visual forms or whatever. It's direct. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in terms of looking at how Graceland hit the world was in the partnerships is how that moment in time Graceland as an album and a concept had to be translated into video, into cover art, into, like once the album's finally done,
Yeah.
before it's even translated into a tour, which is yet another form of translating this into stage production. It just how how all these brilliant people and are able to use their knowledge of Paul. But and I want to ask about that. But before you go into answering that, also I think it was so beautiful the way you, in your words in this book, kind of translate this story into one book, one medium of words. But can you talk about and it made me think of, and I wanted to somehow loop into this, your history with liner notes. Um,
Oh, okay. No, I'm
so
happy to do that. I mean, let's put it this way: music, especially when we're talking about music as physical formats, LPs, CDs, cassettes, etc. It was a different idea. The idea of packaging, the idea of promotion, the idea of music videos. I mentioned MTV. Was in its first flowering. In the mid '80s. And so the role of the visual in conveying the music was suddenly really important. And we're dealing with a short guy who's in his mid 40s and doesn't look like the like Van Halen and the hair metal bands that are on MTV, or Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk. He's not dancing like that, you know. But he does play a very good Stan Laurel in the Laurel and Hardy kind of effect that is the "You Can Call Me Al" video with Chevy Chase. You know, um, the idea of the visual is very important here, and packaging, especially when we're talking about music as a commodity, is something that you purchase. I mean, streaming, we're in a different world now. Back then it was all about albums and mixtapes and making your own mixtapes. Nowadays it's playlists and sharing a playlist with a URL that you send via email. So we're living very digitally, and we're paying for music as a service, a utility that we sign up for, as opposed to actually owning all the CDs that you see behind me there. That's the Coltrane rack there, you know. Um,
beautiful.
yeah, so this was definitely a challenge, Kimberly, to kind of paint that picture and try and get a younger audience, to younger readership, to understand how things were different back in the 80s. So I try and do it gently. I try and suggest the role that, finding the right image for the cover of Graceland, finding the guy who actually chose that and ran it by Paul and got Paul's blessing. Jeff Ayeroff, who was considered one of the kingpins of music videos. He's the guy who put together the Sledgehammer video for Peter Gabriel that same year in 1986, and was involved with the branding or the rebranding of ZZ Top, which had a resurgence around that time. So finding the right guy who was really working with that medium of music videos and images and covers, etc. Finding Jeff and getting a really great interview with him was one of the godsends of this project. So I'd love that you picked up on that. But how does this connect to my writing liner notes? I mean, I've kind of established this, another reputation. Part of my reputation is based on the success I've had with being able to write liner notes for John Coltrane, historic John Coltrane projects, Miles Davis, various other box sets. Derek and the Dominoes, Eric Clapton, one of the things I'm proudest of. But that didn't win an award, but I'm very, very proud of what I did with that. I will say that there's two things that kind of connect to everything I do. One is I don't want my words to stand in the way of the music. I want to deliver the reader back to the music. So if the pages turn easy and the next thing the CD goes on or someone's streaming the album or whatever, my work is done. And the second thing is to consider having your words next to anyone's music, whether it's new or historic or whatever. For me, is an extreme privilege that I take very seriously, and I want it to be so good or done so well that this could be the last time that words are needed to frame a piece of music. But again, that frame should not be confining. It shouldn't prevent the reader from getting into the music, but deliver them into the music.
I think, I'm a book his I think it's so important to have that contextualization. And I think it's an opportunity for the music to mean more and to understand it better. And one of the things that I loved learning about in this book, and we've discussed it a little bit, was how the words here, they weren't an afterthought at all. They were hugely important, but they were after the music. And it was so, I was wondering, it struck me that this contrast of like distance and connection that's happening everywhere around this whole subject. And what I love about the book, and one of the treats for people who buy the book from the Country Bookshop at the link you all have, one of the joys is going to the way you go into the lyrics for each of the songs and how they came to be and the questions and just all the details of them. But the physicality of place making that comes up, and kind of these, Arizona, Graceland, and all of these things very familiar to the American ear versus these sounds that are very foreign to the American ear.
Yeah.
It's not just that, oh, there's a little bit of music from all over Africa plus township jive. It's just all foreign. But, I'm wondering if you can talk about the lyrics a little more, and you somewhere in the book, Paul's talking about his growth on lyrics, wanting them to not be so esoteric, ironically.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that that's strange, you know. The role of the subconscious is something that many artists deal with. Anyone involved with creative expression knows that sometimes out of the blue some idea will come to mind, and you'll have someone like a Paul McCartney saying, where did these lyrics or where did these chords come from? I know I've heard it somewhere else, but he can't kind of backtrack it. He can't find the breadcrumbs going back to whatever. And then this incredible classic tune called Yesterday is born, you know. But somehow when you live within your medium, when you live a music directed life, all this inspiration is going to come and it's going to speak to you and it's not going to let you go. And the perfect example of this with Paul and Graceland is Graceland. You know, the idea that the term Graceland was for Paul a placeholder. He did not expect to be writing a song about Elvis Presley's home in Memphis. What the heck does that have to do with the rhythms and melodies and inspiration that's coming from South Africa? Now, at the same time, I should, just quick tangent, the album liner notes, and Paul had never really done liner notes before, except for one album that was it was a UK release only back in the early 60s, Paul Simon's songbook, or mid 60s. But he had never really explained his music or taken the time. This Grayson is the only other time that he does this. And he opens by saying that in the music of South Africa and in the music of Zydeco, music from West Louisiana, and Norteño rock from East LA, Los Lobos, etc., what he's hearing is the same visceral charge, the same kind of electricity that he felt as a teenager when he first encountered rock and roll with Elvis, with Little Richard, with Chuck Berry, doo-wop groups especially. So the idea that somehow this project is going to lead him back to Graceland works both musically, because he does take a trip to Memphis. He does visit Elvis's home. Remember, this is about 8 years after Elvis had passed. So Elvis's legend is still sort of, it hasn't.
Material.
Yeah, it's still fluid. You know, I don't know if you remember, but in the '80s, you were too young. But in the '80s, there was this thing about the New York, the post office was going to put Elvis on a stamp, but they had people vote on whether it was going to be early Elvis, rockabilly Elvis, or Las Vegas Elvis. And the world kind of looked at Elvis as these two different things, you know. So it was still fluid as to how to process that legend, etc. But when Paul goes and he visits this mansion, this house, it's not really a mansion; it's just a big house, built by a podiatrist in the 1930s. And his wife's name was Grace, and Elvis's mother's name was Grace. But he finishes the tour and he goes out and he sees their graves. Elvis is buried there. Grace is, his mother is buried there. And there is this feeling of coming home, of what it is to find a state of grace, and the metaphorical import of that word and that term and that idea suddenly takes over. And of course, he is at the time. I mean, this is very, very much a midlife kind of song. This isn't the kind of song that 20-year-olds write about breaking free and born to run and, etc. It's about finding home. And that's what he's after the dissolution of his second marriage to, which was with Carrie Fisher. That's kind of, he goes, well, that's what's inside me. That's what I'm looking for. And not long after the album comes out, of course, he meets Edie Brickell, who he, and they build a family, 3 kids, and they're still together.
I also, I love that he adds his child from his first marriage in, again, centering it in midlife. And what struck me in the book when you talk about him walking to the grave is written on there all around the world. And it really, that grace and that universality of all around the world brings me, the production. Let's talk about, and we were talking about a few moments ago, the clarity, the connection, the purity, the clear communication of music and performance.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk about that now. And this is how you end the books. There's the album, and then there's this tour and the touring that you were a part of. And I think somebody who's joined us live did comment that they were able to join in for some of this performance. Well, first, can you tell us about not you as the historian, but you as a participant, just
Yeah.
to contextualize it for
Well,
us?
I had given up on writing. I wanted to go into journalism coming out of Columbia University where I went to school. And I could have chosen my path, and yet I was so driven to music. I was driven by music. I was also driven by the idea of wanting to be there where artists and audience connect, where the magic of music most happens. Most music nowadays, other than live performance, is such a private act. Nobody listens to recordings together in a group like we used to in the college dorm or whatever, because we're listening through speakers. Now we have headphones and earbuds and computer and laptop speakers. That's how a majority of people, listen to music. It's a private act. But there was something driving me to the idea of working with live performance. And I did that when I was living down in New Orleans. I came up to New York I got a gig at Central Park Summer Stage, and we had in the very first summer that I was there the occasion to to present Ladysmith Black Mambazo doing their own show in Central Park Summer Stage, and it was amazing. And through that, I met the management people who were managing Ladysmith and working very closely with Paul. They were also Paul's production team. And we connected, and the door to the world opened, and I ran away with the circus, so to speak. It was a magic time. It was magic because of the quality of the music. The audiences always, on a nightly basis, were stunned by the quality of music expression, the synchronized stage movements, the synchronized vocal harmonies, and it was all a cappella, and it was beautiful, and it was joyous. And this is music coming out of very grim circumstances, which always blew me away, was the kind of disparate nature of how beautiful and life affirming this music was, and yet it's coming from as I said, the subjugation of apartheid. And at the end of every tour, when I worked with these guys, and we went around the world 3 times, sometimes working with Paul in Graceland, sometimes on our own, but I would see them off at the airport knowing that they were going back to a system that was, so unbelievably unfair and out of date and out of touch with what the reality was. And at the same time, by the way, as the late 80s morphed into the 90s, you had things happening like the uh, the independence of all the Eastern European nations suddenly from the Soviet Union suddenly happened. The Berlin Wall came down. The reunification of Germany was imminent. um, uh, uh, the talks in South Africa between the government and the African National Congress started to happen, with the idea of ending apartheid and one man, one vote coming back. And then Nelson Mandela was freed. All of this was happening as we were touring, and there was this amazing, burst of sunshine, and the
Mhm.
headlines were positive, and it was a unique time.
You talk about that, and you talk about the difficulty of trying to convey to people who weren't in that moment. To quote you to you, a time when the world seemed to be moving in sync towards a common good. It is the way you describe it. And you're talking another quote you have, you say, the Graceland glow was a visceral charge of bright, hopeful energy. And and then you talk about a quote from Joe Stummer about youth. Can you, I have a comment on
Joe
that.
Strummer, yeah,
Sure,
from the
yeah,
Clash. you
but
know
bring that up, and then I have a thought and a comment back, and a question as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of your viewers here, one of the readers is commenting about their visceral moments, that memory, and believe me, I talk everyone I talk to would have a certain concert or a certain event that they went to where they were just blown away, and the power of the music was elevating and transcendent. It just took them out of who they were and out of that moment in time, and that's what great music should do anyway. Is like connect you with this kind of timeless reality, that is almost otherworldly. And Mambazo did that on a nightly basis. It was incredible, but also the idea of it not being stuck in any one genre or any one generation. And we think about music, as far as the marketing and the demographics and the which audience listens to what music, etc. And it's funny, the quote from Joe Strummer that you're talking about, he did an interview in Los Angeles. This is after the Clash had kind of ended. This is 1987, 88. And he talks about how great music should only be made by 20-year-olds, except for Paul Simon in Graceland. And then it suddenly hit me when I read that quote how important that was to cross generations. And that's why the very last image in the book is from a friend of mine who witnessed a performance during the Graceland tour at MSG, Madison Square Garden, here in New York, where a absolutely distracted high school crowd, inner city high school crowd, who had been given a bunch of tickets to go and attend Graceland, were, kind of throwing spitballs at each other, not listening to the music until You Can Call Me Al hits. And that had penetrated their reality. They even knew the bass break, Bagidi Kumalo's bass break in it, and it connected with them. And it still connects. I hear again and again. My parents would play this album all the time at home, and it became a family album. And I now play it for my kids.
You know, and I spend all my time with books and talking about them, and just in thinking about stuff basically. But that quote hit me. Um, it was really interesting to me, and I still look forward to like pulling it apart further. But the way I thought about it is it kind of spoke back to how petrified Paul was creating the album, and being scared but doing it anyway. And it took him how long it took him to even reach out to Ladysmith Black Mom. Just he was petrified to do it. And
Well, if he was petrified, he wouldn't have done it. The fact is that he does worry a lot. It's who he is as a creative. This is the guy, by the way, who put not one version but two versions of a song called "Think Too Much" on an album. You know, and in fact, that was the original title of Hearts and Bones, was "Think Too Much," and it was going to be the Simon and Garfunkel reunion album until he scrubbed Artie off of the tracks and released it as his own solo album. But he is someone who is very meticulous. Not everyone is like that, and not every musician, you know, works well in that kind of environment, especially if someone else is that way. And that might be why Simon and Garfunkel had issues. It also might be why Paul, and Los Lobos don't talk to each other, and why that kind of feud between them continues to this day. But because when they worked together, it was not loose and friendly. Let's put it that way. Although I love that track they came up with. But the thing is that Paul creates his magic the way that he does it, and it's very different from any other artists, and or it's bound to be. We're all unique individuals, but it's part of the story as well.
I love it. And we're closing in. And if anyone who has attended live has, I've been loving the comments. But if anyone has any specific questions, please put them in the chat for our last few minutes here. You kind of end your last paragraph with one generation leaving lights on for the next. And I think it's so interesting to talk. You're a professor, so I'm assuming you're constantly having conversations
Yeah,
with.
I'm involved in that regard all the time, and I'll have students who come up to me and say, "You have to listen to this new group," and I go, "You're right, I do. Please send it to me." You know, and they'll say, "Oh, I hear what you're talking about. I hear in that. And then I'll just say, well, there you go. That's the power of music. That it crosses generations, that the same ideas and the same kind of level of inspiration, hopefully, you will continue to hear again and again and again. And that is why being musically focused, musically aware, culturally aware is so important. It's who we are, you know, which blows me away when something like the Kennedy Center gets shut down. Why? For the stupidest of reasons, but
Well, because music's too powerful. I
uh,
mean,
true. Maybe that's a good
um,
answer. Yeah,
that is,
yeah,
if it wasn't so powerful, it wouldn't matter.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there is a reason why we have culture, you know, and it's about being honest, authentic, connected, knowing who we are as a people, being able to talk about it, being able to hear honest, authentic expression from others. It's so important, and it's one of the reasons I definitely wrote the book. Is to remember this incredibly optimistic, happy moment when things seem to work right. You know, and by the way, with the controversy that kind of still dogs the album, I think people miss the point. The value of what Paul did, his intention of his spirit of intention in wanting to do it right. Those lessons are still with us today of how music should, especially if you're going to collaborate between a very kind of exalted position and a place of entitlement, like a rock star, with other artists from especially from other cultures where that do not get to participate in the same resources and treasures and support. It has to be done in a right way. It has to be done in a way that guarantees proper credit and compensation, and participation, you know, and that's what Paul provided.
The whole thing comes back to as the power of diplomacy because talking about looking back and being able over time to have conversations with people, it is diplomacy. It's just through all the different mediums, it's beautiful. We are at our end time, and I want to thank all of y'all for joining live, all of y'all listening in the future, and buying the book from the Country Bookshop and reading it and sharing it, and also and mostly Ashley for writing the book and then coming to chat or taking the time to chat with us. It's really fun to see what kind of legs these conversations have. And so if you enjoy this, share it with your friends and talk about it. And it's um, been really a treat to re-listen to the album with all of this, with the giant liner notes you've given us.
Well, my thanks to you, Kimberly. Thanks for inviting me into this very special space that you've created here. But my biggest thanks I always reserve for the musicians themselves. Ladysmith Black Mambazo, Joseph Shabalala, who's gone on, but and above all, Paul. Thank you for your vision and thank you for your fortitude in sticking true to this. So thank you. I'm left with nothing but gratitude. You know. Thank you for
Oh,
this moment.
well, thank you. And Ashley, stay on for 1 second. I have a question and thank you all. And I will appreciate it very much.